From Newsweek, FBI agents sued DOJ over unlawful and retaliatory January 6th list. So a group of FBI agents brought a class action lawsuit against the Justice Department on Tuesday, accusing it of carrying out an unlawful and retaliatory directive from President Donald Trump to purge the Bureau of Agents who worked on the January 6th, 2021 Capitol riot probe and the classified documents investigation into Trump. Newsweek reached out to the White House and Justice Department for comment via email. I think that this goes back to the idea that there seems to be a question: does the executive actually run the executive branch, or does the bureaucracy run the executive? The president should be, in my opinion, the president should be able to fire whoever he wants, whenever he wants, for whatever reason, as long as they're in the executive branch, right? If they're in the Justice Department, if they're in the whatever, if the president decides this person is not carrying out the policies and the prescriptions that I have for the government, then the president should be able to fire them. And I think that this might turn into court cases. Obviously, they're suing, but I could imagine this going to the Supreme Court. This was essentially the same kind of argument we discussed when it came to the 14th Amendment thing, when Donald Trump said, "Oh, we're gonna take a look at the 14th Amendment and see if this is actually something that the founders meant. Can the people that are essentially anchor babies, was that the intent?" And it seems like Donald Trump is trying to use the courts to get clarification on these things. What do you guys think?
Well, it's the whole, I think, concept of the unitary executive theory, which is what there's been a lot of back and forth over once they knew President Trump won. But even before it, of course, just in general, what the Supreme Court's been doing. Of course, the mainstream media depicts it. I think they give the limited hangout version where it's like, oh, evil, democratically elected dictator Trump wants to subsume all three branches of government. But the unitary executive theory paradigm is just the idea that he is the chief magistrate. And I think for so long they've been pushing that the DOJ is an independent entity, which of course oversees the FBI. So that's why I think even in some of the media coverage of this, they're already sort of starting to invoke the concept of having an independent, judiciary and the rule of law. It's also important. We know it's all complete BS. President Trump will win. And I think there's a lot of brilliant conservative legal minds who've been working kind of preemptively on strengthening and bolstering the unitary executive theory. But I do think you're very right. This is going to end up working itself through the courts, probably all the way up to the Supreme Court or something to that effect.
Yeah, this is another one of those things that Trump is doing where it is going to probably wind up at the Supreme Court, and they're going to have to make some really difficult decisions about how legal this is. In my opinion, I agree with you. I hope that he does have that power and he can maintain that power because, the Founding Fathers' vision was to have the checks and balances to keep, to prevent some sort of monarchist taking over the government. But we're at a point now where the bureaucracy is so corrupt and so demented and so obfuscated behind this notion of democracy that you actually need somebody to have monarchist or executive powers.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that from Trump.
I've been thinking about that all day, actually, because like DOJ, this department DOJ, it's the U.S., it used to be called USDS, Digital Services. Obama started it in 2014, and it's under the executive. And so there's an administrator, and now when Trump took over, he renamed it, and I can't tell if there's even an administrator for the company, but it looks like it's being run by Elon, who's a guy in the private sector who has businesses, and like if you're going to head a government department, you've got to quit your job. You're not supposed to. I don't know if you're supposed to. Maybe not necessarily. I don't know.
There's no law that says you have to quit your job.
But they just do it. Then they just do it, and they can't control their stock portfolios.
He's essentially an advisor to the president.
Yeah, he's not technically the administrator of DOJ. There isn't one that I can tell. So, but it's like I'm like, well, sometimes you got to break the law to do what's right. Like I'm thinking of when they suspended habeas corpus after the Civil War, and they just went full martial law to reinstate order, and that was apparently the right thing. And it's like, whoa, well, the Constitution was toilet paper for a moment. And like, is that where we're at right now that we need? It's terrifying.
Yes. The Constitution is toilet paper. It is. I mean, even today, we don't have those rights.
It could go real bad real fast if we treat it like toilet paper, though.
It's been treated. It's been treated like toilet. It's been treated like toilet paper. The idea that the 10th Amendment is in full effect, I think that everyone around the table can agree that the 10th Amendment only holds power when the federal government feels like it. and the 10th Amendment is pretty clear. Any states not expressly delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people. And that expressly delegated means that are specifically said in the Constitution. But the federal government has said, oh, well, the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause essentially are blanket powers over anything that we want to do. And the federal government has taken that to mean that they can regulate and pass laws about you, like farming on your own property, or you growing feed for your animals on your own property. I forget the name of the court case, but that was an actual case that went before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that because of the Commerce Clause, because this farmer was growing feed for his cattle on his own property, because he was not buying it from the open market, the federal government could actually regulate what he was and was not doing on his own property. That kind of overreach, which it is clearly overreach. There's anyone that listens to that, of course they think it's ridiculous. Any normal person, the only people that don't think it's ridiculous are the people that want access to that kind of power. So the 10th Amendment is no longer fully functional. Then that is it's been papered over. So just like Chris said, it is toilet paper nowadays. The Second Amendment, it can't get any more clear than, shall not be infringed. The Fourth Amendment, your right to be left alone, your person, your papers. The police constantly perform what they call civil asset forfeiture, which is they just take your shit and they just sell it, or they'll auction it off. These things are expressly prohibited by the Bill of Rights, by the Second, the Fourth Amendment, and they're routinely ignored. So the idea that the Constitution actually prevents things the way that it was intended, that ship sailed a long time ago.
It seems like because the bureaucracy has kind of commandeered the government, that if you try and play by the rules that they're violating, you're not going to be able to undo the control mechanism, that you have to go outside of the rules to do it. Well,
it's actually worse than that, I think. I mean, you've heard of the concept of the cathedral, right?
What is it?
So the cathedral is really what runs things. It's this loosely connected affiliation of academia, Hollywood, the federal government, big corporations, big tech. They all sort of tacitly agree because they've all been put through the university system, and they know what the appropriate way to act is, the appropriate things to say and not to say. So you have like these giant institutions, and many of which are non-governmental. They all pretty much agree on the status quo. So that's when you have the cathedral, then you don't really effectively have the First Amendment because you're self-censoring, and you can pay big premium prices for saying something that goes against what the cathedral would have you say.
I also just don't buy their performative activism and selective outrage over Constitution. Like,
absolutely, 100%.
Spare me, right?
100%.
Also, I'm sorry, the same people, it's like when they're like, oh, the American consumers are going to be screwed by the tariffs. I'm like, you guys lied about inflation for 4 years. Spare me. But I did just want to bring up one semi-unrelated thing too, but in a similar vein. One of the attorneys it's like the Center for Employment Justice, something like that, who's representing, I believe it's 9 anonymous agents. While I was driving here, I had gone through her Twitter to see what she had been putting out about just in general, MAGA, and she's tweeted repeatedly about how all of MAGA needs to be fired from the federal government. Quote, America needs industrial strength disinfectant of the MAGA bacteria in our institutions. Clean the wound, Mr. President. Fire them all. Quote, if we are to remove MAGA at the ballot box, then you must remove MAGA from our institutions. Fire DeJoy, fire Flynn, fire Wray. And then my favorite, she's all saying this to Biden, it is time for the Biden admin to remove MAGA from our government. Yeah. So the idea that these people are being pushed out over political retribution, it's not. President Trump is allowed to have, I know I can't say it, but loyalists. Yes. And these people are such hypocrites. So I don't even take them at face value. It's like, shut up. You're a bunch of liars. And by the way, what was it? The 5,000 agents of the 16,000, upwards of 30%, were all weaponized and deputized to do the January 6th stuff. But the January 6th is so critical, right, to their whole regime narrative. Like, that is where they just derive their state power from. Yep. And they will sue because they have to.
I mean, they go so far as, everyone's familiar with the argument or the non-argument that it was an insurrection, even though nobody on that day was charged with insurrection. Insurrection is an actual law that you have to, there are qualifications, there are things you have to do to actually be considered to actually have engaged in insurrection. Nobody was charged with insurrection. Donald Trump clearly wasn't engaged in insurrection by telling people that they should, peacefully protest. But yet you still hear that narrative. Donald Trump is an insurrectionist. Donald Trump is an insurrectionist. There were people that were saying, right before the inauguration, or between when Donald Trump was reelected and when he was inaugurated, or January 6th, they were saying, oh, we need to have the vice president say that Donald Trump isn't actually he can't be confirmed because he actually engaged in insurrection, and the 14th Amendment says, et cetera, making the argument, even though they're ignoring the fact that without due process, you can't be said to have actually engaged in an insurrection. You have to be found guilty of insurrection to have been involved in an insurrection, and he wasn't found guilty of insurrection, so you can't. So the 14th Amendment clearly doesn't apply. But again, they don't care about what the Constitution says. They only care about exercising power, and so they'll use parts of the Constitution to exercise power when they can, if they're allowed to, and they'll ignore other parts of the Constitution. So I do think it's super important to get this stuff in front of the courts. I like the idea of these people suing. I like the idea of the laws being questioned and brought to the courts, because I think the court will come down and say, look, we have an elected official. Donald Trump, the president, is elected by the American people, and he has a platform that he ran on. And the American people said, these are the policies that we prefer, as opposed to the other option. And if that's the case, then he needs to have the authority to hire people that will implement the policies that he ran on. And if you have, just like you were saying, the loyalists, that you need to have people that are going to carry out the policies because you actually were elected for a reason. If you have people that are obstructing the president, then you actually have people that are obstructing the will of the American people, because they voted to have Donald Trump as the president. They want to see the policies that he proposed on the campaign trail. They want to see those put into effect.
Unless, what were you going to say?
No, go ahead.
Unless the president goes crazy, and then you need people to be like, hold up there.
But that's what the 25th Amendment's for.
Where the VP comes in and takes over.
If the president goes crazy, the 25th Amendment is...
If the president and vice president go crazy together, then the people are supposed to be like, stop. We can't let you do this.
Well, if you're talking about the people, then you're talking about the Second Amendment, and that's something we should be discussing.
Just bureaucrats disallowing what the orders and stuff like that, like civil disobedience.
No,
because it is a slippery slope that if you get a dangerous demagogue into the president, I'm not saying that's what's happening, but this is the rationale for why they would oppose his will. You don't always want to just bow down to the executive's will because he's the executive. You got to make sure that it's good and right.
We have the House can impeach if those things are going on. The House has the power to write up articles of impeachment while the president's in office, and the Senate can impeach. The House has to write them up, and then the Senate will try them and see if he actually did violate the law. And if that's the case, there are means. The Constitution has means to deal with all the things that you're talking about. Right, like the Constitution does provide a means to get rid of a crazy president. The Constitution has a means to get rid of a lawless president, whether it be the impeachment or because he's crazy, the 25th Amendment. So the things that you're worried about, it's not good to say, well, let's have the bureaucrats just ignore it. Use the actual Constitution. Use the laws that are written in the Constitution. Use the process, so that way it's legitimate. Because if you're just saying, well, he seems crazy and it's more expedient to have the bureaucracy just not listen, then you're going to have the next president say, well, I don't have to listen. I'm going to get my people in and we're just going to ignore the law. And you're making the country more lawless. You're making the Constitution more toilet paper. You're only adding to the problem by doing those things, which is the argument that conservatives usually give. They're like, look, we try to do things the right way because this is the process that works. The left tends to say we want the results and the process is less important, which is why people on the left will do things like we're discussing. They'll ignore parts of the Constitution sometimes and they'll say, oh, this is super important part of the Constitution this time, but next time it's not. Because they're not worried about the process, because the result is what they're after. But the process matters, because if you don't, and that's why like leftist like you see all kinds of like basket case countries that had socialist governments because they don't care about the process. They only want the result. What they're looking for is the government to just make things happen for the people in the way that they want. And that's not how anything works. Like that, you can't just magic up results. You have to have a process that works.
So, okay, were you going to say something?
Yes. Well, like to that point, I was just like, remember there was the Democrats sitting on the steps of USAID today demanding we need to shut down the Senate and we are at war. But I do think it is interesting because I don't think
that? They said we need to shut down the Senate and we're at war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I forget who said that, but yeah.
Yeah, I liked it better when Andrew Breitbart said war than some dysgenic Democrat outside of USAID. But I think it's an interesting, I think from a narrative perspective, because if you watch, I watch a lot of MSNBC, but like Jen Psaki yesterday, right, was calling what Elon Musk was doing a quote unquote hostile takeover of the United States government. And yes, we can parse out the Elon Musk issue. You know my show, Steve has been critical of some of the stuff that he's done. We're not like full blown Elon simps. But I think that framing of it is sort of interesting, and I think it plays into, I would argue, sort of the color revolution matrix, color revolution theory of the people like Norm Eisen and these people who overseas, whether it was like Ukraine in 2014, but have sort of used certain tactics like the concept of civil society to bring about regime change. And now they're using those same tactics here at home. One of the like seminal textbooks or just papers that they put out was called The Democracy Playbook back in 2019. It came from the Brookings Institution. It was written by Norm Eisen, who played a really intimate role in what happened in Ukraine and the Czech Republic and a bunch of Eastern European countries. They just put out a newly revised edition on January 17th, no coincidences, no conspiracies, but talking about how they were sort of cross-applying those tactics to prevent democratic backsliding here in the United States. And I just sort of reject the premise that a democratically elected president who's delivering on campaign promises is an autocrat or is an authoritarian. And I think that they're very keen on that messaging because then it gives them the sort of extra constitutional mandate and power to oppose anything that he's doing because he's a dictator, he's an autocrat. If we don't stop this, democratic backsliding is happening and the country is going to cease to exist. It gives them their raison d'etre, their reason to exist. So that's why I just think even this discussion, you can see how it creeps in, you know what I mean? But it's such an interesting, I just think, psychological way to like look at, he's delivering more or less on campaign promises and occasionally says things that are, I would argue, more art of the deal as opposed to like actual concrete policy, but they view it as like a hostile takeover of the United States government. No, the American people elected Trump. Elon played a very visible role, right, on the campaign trail. Yep. They said they were going to create DOJ. They said they were going to cut spending. If anything, they haven't cut enough spending. So it's just an interesting framing that I think if you really look why they're doing it, it's because they want to do what they've done to foreign countries in terms of the color revolutions. They want to do that to us here at home.
You said they printed a paper on the 17th of January?
Yeah, it's called The Democracy Playbook. It was written by, I think, Jonathan Katz and Norm Eisen out of the Brookings Institution. The first edition, I think, was put out in 2019. The second one was like early 2020 time. And then they put a revised third edition out January 17th, 2025. And they go through like the 7 priorities of how to prevent democratic backsliding in the United States. Step 1 is like securing elections, preserving civil society, having a strong media, basically outlining the resistance. And just on the USAID point, I do think it is very interesting because one of the things that they were advocating for in this paper, and for what it's worth, Norm Eisen was the guy who sued DOJ initially within 3 minutes of the Trump administration. Norm Eisen's State Democracy Defenders Group has collaborated with Mark Zaid, who is one of the lawyers that was behind the first impeachment of President Trump, to also sue the FBI. There was a big story in the Huffington Post yesterday about that. So these are like very key players. They're not just some random people. But I was reading through the report today. We're talking about it on War Room, and USAID is mentioned dozens of times. The report's like 158 pages or whatever. And one of the things that they mentioned was like, in order to have a strong resistance movement, we have to have international partners and allies to push back against President Trump. And so to me, when I hear what's going on at USAID, I'm like, oh, you guys wanted to launder a bunch of money to a bunch of international resistance groups in the name of democracy, and that was how you were going to resist President Trump, because that's what they called for in the playbook by the same guy who's suing DOJ, right? So these are all the same act. Like, this is, I know the deep state is a very nice cutesy term, but like, this is the deep state, right? Like, if there's a face to it, it's actions like this, and they have their finger in the lawsuits and everywhere. But from just a narrative perspective. And to that point, last thing I know, I'm talking about.
It's fine. That's why you're here. We're interested in your perspective.
I've been told I'm a DEI hire. No. But last night, Rachel Maddow does a 25-minute monologue. You would think that she probably would have covered USAID or the confirmation hearings. What does she spend the 25 minutes on? Going on and on about the power and importance of independent and alternative media and how it's under assault and how they're going after NPR and CBS and blah, 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 blah.
Those are, she called those independent.
Which I was like, girl, you need to get a dictionary because that's not independent media. But my point is, it's very curious to me on the day that USAID is getting crippled, which I would argue was going to be the linchpin in funding a lot of these resistance efforts, which was sort of contained to this sector of society that was civil society and media because they have no governmental power, to see Rachel Maddow imploring her audience, go donate to independent media, go support left-wing media. It's an interesting thing, right? Like the timing. So that's why I think they're in such meltdown. And removing these people from these buildings also removes a bunch of sources, right, for MSNBC. And by the way, they're still having these inspector generals, all these DOJ people. They're still having them on MSNBC. Yep. But their chyrons are not, this is the role and I'm leaking. It's like former fired inspector general.
Yeah, and there was a long time where they were just considered leakers or whatever.
Yeah.
There's nothing that the establishment media hates more than losing access. It's one of the things that I've talked about multiple times. You don't need to have direct payments when you can offer people access, inside information and access, because that if you have someone in the high up in the bureaucracy's phone number, that's the same thing as having power. If you can call that person and say, look, I need a favor, can you get me information? That kind of power, that kind of access is the whole point of money a lot of times.
Thanks for checking out this clip from Timcast IRL. Make sure to watch the show live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. Subscribe to this channel, and we will see you all there.